Welcome back to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach, president of the Church State Council, here with my co-host, Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, the oldest and by far and away the very best journal devoted exclusively to issues of religious freedom. And together, we're trying to take liberty back from the political extremes. We're even toying with calling ourselves culture war peacemakers. Peacemakers. I like it. Let me know what you think.
Too, Alan. I think we need to make that our official title.
Well, and our next interview is going to be very, very interesting. Can religion save democracy? Our guest has written a book by that title. Bettina, who are we going to talk to today?
Today we are delighted to be joined by Reverend Dr. Matthew Kaemingk, a Christian ethicist, a public theologian. He teaches public theology at the Theological University Utrecht. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Public Justice. He also helps lead the Templeton Pluralism Fellowship. And his latest book has an intriguing title, Can Religion Save Democracy? It's co-authored with Shadi Hamid, and together they're arguing that maybe what our democracy needs is not less religion in public life, but more. And we're excited to talk to you today. Matthew, welcome to Just Liberty.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to be with all of you. I'm looking forward to a spirited discussion of religion and politics and liberty and all good things. So thank you so much for having me.
What sparked this idea for you, whether democracy actually needs more religion? What set off this train of thinking?
Yeah, so my research background is in political theory and political philosophy. And I've always been very interested in what sustains a democracy. So, of course, it's one thing to start a democracy. I think Ben Franklin said, famously when they walked out, we gave you a republic if you can keep it. And so one of the questions for the American framers was what will sustain a democracy? And many of the founding fathers of the United States recognized from the very beginning that a constitution could not sustain itself. A democracy could not sustain itself. It depended upon a particular kind of people with a particular set of virtues. So democracy requires patience. It requires, a virtue of trust, a certain level of trust. Even if you think about just the issue of accepting a loss, from time to time, our political party loses. And from time to time, our politicians make bad decisions. Actually, quite often they make bad decisions. But what keeps a population from, burning everything down when things don't go their way? So I think as a political theorist, I've always been interested not so much in how do you make a democracy, but how do you keep it? And this is a fundamental problem for political philosophers, is that democratic governments depend upon a set of virtues that they cannot create, right? So Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi are not capable of teaching me to be a patient man, right? They're not capable of training me to not get my way. And so in order for the democracy of the United States to sustain itself, it actually depends upon something that governments can't produce. And the argument that we make in our book, this Christian and this Muslim, is that actually churches and mosques are one of the important places where People learn patience. They learn to share. They learn to take turns. They learn basic table manners that make democracies last. So that's like at the core what we're interested in a very simple way, but that's basically it.
So, I guess I agree with your basic premise. And I have long considered that even though America is not in any formal sense a Christian nation, that there's a certain kind of cultural capital that we have been borrowing that sustains our democracy, even though we no longer share that same mindset, a kind of a postmodern create your own reality view of the world, may sustain a winner takes all, bring a machine gun to a knife fight kind of politics, but it doesn't lead to the kind of politics that we used to enjoy, where a Ted Kennedy and an Orrin Hatch, two very staunch advocates for very different sets of political values, could come together over and over again and produce really important legislation, right? And the question is how we've been there. It's not the sort of ideal that, some imagine, we want to return to when they think of, the good old days. But we have had a more productive politics in America in the past. I guess my question for you is, what religion do we need? What kind of religion do we need? Because I think a lot of, if we put this in the context of the current debate over Christian nationalism, it's not that Christian values as such are, hostile or contradictory to our democracy. It's, well, what are the values that any religion brings to bear that are making a positive contribution? And are there religious perspectives that are counterproductive?
Yeah, absolutely. So the kind of religion that we need is good religion. And then, of course,
that's a very broad term.
Right? So that doesn't beg any questions at all. So the kind of religion we need is good religion. And you're asking a Christian. So, naturally, and I'm a very sort of Orthodox evangelical Christian. And so quite naturally, I want other people to be Christian. I want other people to know Jesus. And so that's, of course, my particular perspective. But the reality is that America is a multi-religious nation. Europe is multi-religious. And that's not going to change anytime soon. And so, there are many problems with Christian nationalism, right? It's racism, it's hatred, it's fear-based, all of those kinds of things. But another problem with Christian nationalism, is that it is living in a pretend world where America could go back to a sort of dominant Christian. That's just not the reality. And so, so the first one is obviously not all religions and are conducive to democratic life. We have Christian extremism, we have Muslim extremism, we have Jewish extremism. If you go to Sri Lanka, you will find Buddhist extremism. If you go to India, you'll find Hindu nationalism. But it's not just a religious thing. This is not something this problem of becoming dominant and hateful and fearful is not just something for quote unquote religious people. If I were to go to, Soviet Russia or Cuba or China, I would find forms of hatred that are quite secular, forms of tribalism that are quite secular. If I were to go to Paris, France, I would find a form of secularism that is quite hateful towards Muslims. They are forcing little Muslim girls to take off their headscarves in a very sort of dominant ideological way. So this is fundamentally a human problem. It's not unique to Christianity that we struggle with nationalism. This is something human beings are tribal, right? We love to form the concept of we, and we love to form the concept of they. And so this is an issue for every religion and for secular people, is how are you going to live with people whose lifestyle is quite objectionable to you? And you can't extinguish them. They're still there. And that's something we all have to contend with. So I don't go in for those who would say, oh, religious people are hateful and secular people are peaceful. Because what we've found in America is in the last 20 years, there has been a profound drop in religiosity in America. Historic drop in participation in religious institutions. And our politics has not gotten any more peaceful. It's not gotten any more rational. In fact, as American politics becomes more secular, it is actually becoming more hysterical. And that's part of our argument, is that there is something about secularism that actually creates a politics that's like a holy war.
I hear what you're saying, and I do accept what you're saying as true. I mean, clearly, there's not something inherent in religion that makes it peculiarly prone to be misused and to become hateful. However, is there not some sort of alchemy that happens whenever religion enters the political space? And when religion enters the political space, it becomes something else. It becomes something different to what it is intended to be. It becomes something more akin to an ideology like secularism or any other ideology you would like to name. And so is it not an argument for keeping religion out of the public space in terms of, allowing a government to express religious views, for instance?
Yeah, that's wonderful. So I think what I would say is that whenever religion enters political life, it is a dangerous thing, right? There's all kinds of opportunities to hurt others, but not only that, to actually distort the integrity of the religious community as well. So we see this all the time when Christians take power. They like it. And when humans take power, they like it. And it starts to distort, the internal integrity of the church, or the internal integrity of Islam. Muslims like power too. And it just, Islam has some very beautiful values and ideas, but when it becomes political, it can get really distorted. So Matt, but in that way, Bettina, I agree with you. However, I would argue that it is impossible to keep one's faith out of public life. That is just, it's not a possible thing for me to do as a Christian. I can't divide myself into two people. I can't pretend that I'm secular in the public sphere and Christian in the private sphere. And I can't ask a Muslim to do that. I can't ask a Jewish person to do that. I can't ask a Hindu person to do that. When we talk about should the government help poor people? In many ways, that is a moral and religious question that I have to bring my faith to bear in that. And so I completely agree with you that it's dangerous, but I think that it's unreasonable and it's unjust to tell citizens that they have to be two different people. So, yeah.
So Matt, I think what you just said is kind of where I was going, which is I think there's a distinction to be made, and you may be making it, between bringing religion as religion into our politics and bringing our religious values into how we do politics, right? Mm-hmm. So, and the way that I would see this is it's one thing to speak for or against a policy based on your religious values. It's another thing to ask government to support or promote religion as religion, to engage in religious activities and encourage people to share particular religious beliefs or practices, and to use the levers of government to put the thumb on the scale in favor of religion in general or particular religion. So that's where a proper understanding of the separation of church and state in the American context, I think, says, we're whole people. We bring our values to bear. For many of us as Christians, it means that care for the poor and the widow and the orphans and what have you, and the homeless, this is an important role that government should be playing. Others with similar biblical backgrounds may say, no, we believe in self-reliance and, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And, they may apply that set of values to the same policy propositions. You may choose one set of values over the other, and you may prevail in the political equation. But nobody's disqualified from bringing their own faith values to the table, to the debate.
Yeah, absolutely. And on top of that, the thumb on the scale is a really important image, I think, for your listeners to think about, right? Is should the government advantage one religion over another? And as a Christian, not only do I see that as unjust, but I believe that the gospel is persuasive all on its own. I don't believe that the church needs the help of the government. And I don't believe that Jesus needs the help of the government. I believe that Jesus is Lord, that he's king, that he's sovereign. And so there's something about Christian nationalism that actually sees Jesus as weak, that Jesus needs our help, and that the nation is slipping away from Christianity. And that means that somehow the gospel isn't persuasive, and the church needs the help of a strong man. And that's important for me just to say that a belief in religious freedom is a belief that God is in control, right? And that I can trust that he's in control, that I don't need the government to save the church, right?
What you're describing, Matthew, is it's a perfect scenario in terms of, this is how it should operate in an optimal way. But when we look at today's politics and we hear the voices that are calling themselves Christian voices in our politics, it doesn't quite track with the ideals that you're talking about, which I agree are utterly valid, and that's the way it should be. But the reality is different. And I was intrigued by a couple of references I've read in your work about the effect of deinstitutionalization of Christianity on our political involvement. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. So American Christianity today is very different than it was, 100, 200 years ago. 100, 200 years ago, churches were small, they were local, and they were very institutional. So you had like a set of elders, a pastor, a set of laws, and traditions. You were a Lutheran for generations, or you were a Presbyterian for generations, and you made jokes about Methodists, right? And things like that. So American Christianity was more institutional. It was more small. It was more local. You knew your pastor, right? Today, we have mega churches. We have digital pastors and Christian celebrities. We have non-denominational churches that have no real, rules or systems. You have a lot of pastors who don't have any training in seminary. They're not held accountable by anyone, so these pastors are sort of kings. There's no overarching synod or bishop or anyone holding them accountable. So you have this, and Christianity is just much more emotional and emotive. It's more about how you're feeling. So Christians are less educated today in the Bible, in church history. In fact, shockingly, you have many people who call themselves evangelical, who never go to church, who don't actually believe the basic tenets of the Christian faith, but they still call themselves evangelical. So Christianity is more of a vibe today. And so that actually makes Christians vulnerable to national, digital, cable news. They're very vulnerable to sort of national campaigns because they don't have thick local relationships. They don't have a thick local institution. You look to a strong man to save you because you feel detached. You feel lonely. You're on cable news and social media all day. And so this creates a vulnerability. If you have, imagine you're a small town Indiana Methodist in the 1920s, right? And you've got a strong local church. You're known, you're an elder in the church, and you make decisions with the other elders. And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. But you, as a family, you've been a part of that church for generations. No sort of politician is going to be able to pull you out of that thick network, right? Now, fast forward to today, if you just, watch cable news and maybe you listen to a preacher on the radio, and you've lost your job and you've had a divorce and you're kind of detached, and there's a strong man promising that he can save you, and the bad people are out there and everything, is someone else's fault, you're much more vulnerable to political extremism. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the importance of local institutional religion as opposed to digital online charismatic figures. And I think that Pentecostalism is an interesting example of this. And you see a lot of Pentecostal and charismatics swarming around Donald Trump. And that's important to think about. I don't know what you tell me, Bettina, what do you think about all that?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly, because you see much of the momentum for Christian nationalist ideas emerging from networks like the New Apostolic Reformation, for instance, which exactly as you describe. They're diffuse, they're not controlled by any central set of ideas or values or rules, and they're proliferating online. And that's the medium in which they gain traction. So yes, I agree wholeheartedly with that.
But if I may, Bettina,
sure.
I also see the significance in what you're saying of the strong local congregation, right?
Yep.
So, I do double duty as a lawyer and a preacher, and one of my tactics, if you will, in my sermons is to kind of in a stage whisper, tell the audience, did you know some of us voted Republican? And, then to the other side of the church, same stage whisper voted Democrat, but we are one body. We are not us and they. And in some sense, that's where there needs to be the hope for overcoming the divisiveness and the us versus them, and being able to have, a healthy set of religious values that we can contribute in a positive way. Because I think where this discussion started was, there's a need for religious values in the public square, for religion to bring healing to the divisiveness and the chaos of our politics. But, it's what kind of religion, right?
Yeah.
That's where we come back to, is how do we shape our own religious traditions to be able to make a positive contribution rather than, being destructive.
Well, and let's think about that. I mean, that's a beautiful image, right? Of a church of people worshiping together who actually voted for two different candidates.
Which is increasingly rare in this.
That is increasingly rare. And that's a problem, not simply for Christianity. It's a problem for America, because in American democracy today, we are beginning to sort ourselves. So we live in cities and states that match our political identity. We marry people that match and we date people that match our political identity. We go to colleges and universities that match our political identity. So increasingly, we are detaching from one another. And historically, one of the few places where you would have deep relationships with someone from the other party was the church. And so there's this sort of accidental political service that the church provides, which is essentially actually connecting Democrats and Republicans to one another, right? That's not why Jesus came to earth, right? But it does that, right? And you have meals with one another, and you help each other raise your children, and you understand suddenly that the Republican or the Democrat across the pew is not a demon, and that's a unique social space in America that's going away because churches today are starting to sort, and people are starting to select churches with their political tribe. And that's a new thing. That's not good.
And in a way, it is mirroring what's happening on the left, right? Because we come to this issue from the perspective of Christianity. We're Christian, so we're critiquing our problem with Christian nationalism. But this sort of ideological extremism exists also on the left.
Absolutely.
And within post-religious populations. And in a way, it's even more unhinged, I guess, or unanchored with the sort of communities that would allow them to develop those sort of skills that, should be being developed within church communities. So is that another big reason for, our current political state?
Yes, absolutely. And we've been picking on the Christian right here. So let's pick on the secular left for a little while. I think curiously, that's in our book, we probably pick on the secular left more. And it is because, as you say, the secular left lacks a thick community and set of relationships and a moral tradition that can kind of ground and calm and sort of slow down the radicalism. So it ratchets up really quickly and it gets out of hand really quickly, right? And sexuality is if you look at the trajectory of the secular left and what they were arguing for in 1990 compared to today, you see this sort of the ratcheting up of extremism and there's sort of a lack of brakes. No one has brakes to slow it down, right? And there's not really a moral tradition to beyond sexual consent. There's nothing to provide any kind of bumpers. And so what happens is, in a very real way, if you're not getting your identity from a church or a mosque or a synagogue, right? If you're not getting your identity from this ancient text, this ancient religious way of life, what happens is you start to get your sense of meaning and purpose from your political identity. And suddenly your political identity becomes incredibly important. And your sexual identity becomes incredibly important. And it actually has to carry the weight for you of what religious identity used to, right? And so suddenly politics becomes this apocalyptic battle, right? And you'll hear this on the left quite often. This is the most important election of our lifetime, right? Every single election is the most important of our lifetime. And if we lose this, people will die. And so there's kind of this apocalyptic energy. And a big part of that is because politics today carries a sort of religious weight. In a post-religious culture, people need a place to put all of their religious energy, right? They're passionate. But, as Christians, we would say human beings are made to worship. And as St. Augustine would say, our hearts are restless until they rest in God. And so if our hearts do not rest in God, we're going to try to find, some kind of ultimate healing. And so what's happening on the secular left is this spiritual passion is being put into political battle. And so you can see this in the yard sign, like in our house, we believe love is love and, water is life. And, there's no such thing as an immigrant. It's very creedal. It's very religious, actually. And that goes back to my statement that, all people are religious, whether they recognize it or not. And it's best just to admit that and get over it.
So, Matt, I guess one question I have, and you may or may not have perspective on this, but it's easy to overgeneralize and to attribute to both the extremes on the left and the right more influence on kind of the middle, if you will, on ordinary Americans going about trying to pay the mortgage, pay the rent, feed their families, raise their kids, whatever. That there's a lot of us who are neither left or right, and we seem to kind of give all this power to the extremes. And I guess my question is, and the critique that we've been discussing of both, I think is valid, but I think we also need some perspective. How much power does the more extreme elements of the left have on those who are simply would identify as nuns, for example, nuns, not Catholic women, but those who profess no religious affiliation, the largest growing segment of the population, and as you mentioned, the historical decline of religious affiliation. So I guess it's the perspective that I'm looking for here, as between those who are really ideological and those who are just, maybe leaning. They're secular. They may be, leaning towards some of those values, but doesn't mean they're,
Yeah. Well, a couple of comments. One is secular people, or the quote unquote nuns, are becoming more politically diverse. So they're not just on the political left. Donald Trump has actually done a good job developing a secular right that has very little interest in religion. And so there's that we have to pay attention to. And then when it comes to the moderates, or the people who just want to pay the mortgage, as you say, I think that, yes, it's absolutely true that there are more moderates in America, the quiet middle. The problem is that they tend to be checked out of political life, and they lack a political party that represents them. So we only have two political parties, and they tend to be dominated by the extremes. And that's not just a cultural problem. That's actually a structural problem with our Constitution and the way voting works in America, that actually the primary system cultivates some extremes. So that's probably not a conversation for today, but there's something fundamentally wrong with the American voting system, which creates a system where only two parties can exist. And then it encourages more extremism. It doesn't actually encourage political compromise. So if a politician crosses the aisle and compromises, if they sign an imperfect bill, right, just to get it done, they will be punished by their party. And so there are structural problems. And then the last thing is just that most moderates fall into cynicism and bitterness, and they don't get engaged. And so the loud, angry people are the ones who show up. And so that's who we are ruled by. And there's nothing very, and then finally, there's nothing very inspiring about moderate politics. So being a moderate, it doesn't really excite you. It is much more thrilling to have a hero and a villain. And that is a great way to raise money and inspire crowds. And so that's the other problem with moderates.
So, Matthew, as we finish this conversation, I guess we need to circle back to where we started from, which was some critical introspection about how Christianity in America today shows up in politics. There's this sense I have, in any case, that Christianity is like oil and water when it comes to politics, because Christianity, our faith convictions are absolute. There's no room for compromise in them. And I think that sort of skews the way that Christianity is expressed within our political system, which is lubricated by compromise. So why don't you tell us how you wish Christianity would show up, and also how it can show up while still being faithful to the idea of truth, absolute truth?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, perhaps we should finish by talking about Jesus, if that's all right. Because I do think that Christian ethics and Christian politics should have something to do with Jesus. And I think of, on the night that he was betrayed and arrested, in the Garden of Gethsemane, it was dark. There were torches and spears and clubs, and people were coming to arrest him. And there was shouting, and there was chaos. And there was a lot of fear. And some of the disciples chose to fight, and some of the disciples chose to run away. And to me, that's a perfect picture of our political environment today. Is some Christians are choosing to fight in politics, and some are choosing to run away. Some of them thought Jesus came to make everything better immediately and right now. And then some of them thought, oh, he's been arrested. This must be a failure. This must be, not true. So in the chaos of that night, some people chose to fight and some people chose to run away. But there was one person who did something that we just don't expect. There was one person who reached out an unarmed hand and healed. And he healed someone who actually wasn't on his side. He healed someone who was on the other side. And that is the historically fascinating thing about Jesus, right? Human beings have always done the fight or flight thing. Like, that's a very animal thing to do, right? When you're afraid, you either lash out or you run away. And what Jesus offered his disciples was a third way to engage difficulty. He didn't run away from it, and he didn't dominate it, but he was a healing presence. And so as I think about a Christian presence in political life, of course, I have perspectives on issues like abortion and the death penalty and taxes and immigration. And, we could talk about that maybe another time. So fundamentally, though, as I think about what is a Christian presence in politics, is it needs to have this healing third way presence in our democratic life. And American democracy is fragmenting. It's shaking. It's in many ways in real trouble. And my prayer for American Christians is that we will have a healing presence in politics. That doesn't mean that we don't fight for things sometimes, right? It doesn't mean that we give up our convictions. I have very strong convictions, but it means that we fight for things in a way that honors the relationship and honors our fellow citizens. And we refuse to demonize others, right? Even on the cross, Jesus asked that God would forgive the people who were attacking him. And that makes him different from Alexander the Great and Mao Zedong and Napoleon and Muhammad and, all of the other great historical leaders. He commanded his followers to love their enemies. And that's not a common thing for a Republican or Democratic politician to do, to command their followers to love the other party.
That would definitely transform our politics today, no doubt about it. Thank you so much, Matthew, for taking the time to talk with us today. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Bettina. This is just great. You guys I'm so glad you guys are cultivating these conversations, and it is absolutely what's needed. So thank you so much for your work.
So, Alan, I enjoyed this discussion, not least because it seems that so often on this podcast, we are talking about the ways religion is exploited, is misused, and is actually a detriment to democracy in America. But this one is far more positive. It's nice to be positive for a change. What did you think of the overall thesis?
I loved it. It was eye-opening for me to start to think, so much of American public religion is rightly described by the book of Revelation as Babylon, confusion, right? And yet, you and I are devout Christians. We're believers in not just, the divinity of Christ, but the wisdom and beauty of the ethical teachings of Scripture. And we absolutely believe that the ethical teachings of Scripture are enormously positive for society, for democracy. So, that's something that I think deserves a lot more attention. And I'm glad we this interview will help us to keep our balance in the future as we continue to talk about these issues.
So what fascinated me is, yes, he was talking about the component of values that different religions bring to public life, but he was also talking about the practices, the habits, the skills that are incubated in religious communities, that if they're done right, if a religious community is a healthy one, then those skills translate very, very well into practicing democratic participation. And I don't know about you, Alan, but I agree. I mean, in a church setting where you are self-governing as a body, you are basically a little mini democracy right there in that church. You need to learn how to disagree gracefully and how to sit next to someone who you have profound differences with in many areas of life or belief. And this is a skill that our society is in desperate need of today, clearly.
Listening to you now, Bettina, you're bringing back memories. One of my favorite places to visit in terms of religious freedom is colonial Williamsburg.
Yes, me too.
And one of my favorite places in colonial Williamsburg is the old Bruton Parish Church. And, this is the same church building where the Virginia elites, the Jeffersons and Washingtons and Madisons and Patrick Henry and all the rest, where they would go and worship. It's an Anglican church. And it was run very democratically. I forget what, they didn't call them elders, they called them something else back then. But essentially, the leadership of the church chose the clergy, right? And I could see, as I was hearing, the tour guide and listening to how they governed the church back then, how the church was the incubator for American democracy in a very real way in colonial America.
So interesting, Alan, because yes, churches and faith communities can incubate democratic values, but then look at the Puritans at the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That was a faith community that was incubating entirely different civic values, authoritarianism, for instance, hostility toward dissent.
Well, and so, this is the struggle that we were discussing with our guests, and the struggle that we still have today between two very different sets of religious values. Do we have religious values that are making a positive contribution, or values that divide, right? And that are about seeking power rather than working together to resolve conflict? Because really, the way I see democracy working, and I've been here in the Pacific Union Conference serving a 5-state region for more than 30 years, and we have a legislative program, very active. And as we participate in the state legislative process, what we see is that legislators are confronted with problems to solve. And there's input from many different sources, and how various solutions will have either a positive or a negative impact. And everybody tries to, get their voice, and the legislators are there to try to figure out, is there a way forward to solve a problem that doesn't have too many unintended consequences that are going to harm somebody else? And that's how it works at its best. It doesn't always work that way, right? But that's how it works at its best, is, resolving conflict and solving problems rather than dividing and just seeking power for the sake of power. So yeah, our politics have definitely fallen into a bad pattern in recent years. But the best aspects of how church does community can have a really positive effect. And I hope that we go in that direction.
Which is food for thought for all of us, as we're navigating this reality where religion quite literally can erode democracy or can serve to build up democracy. I think we really are at that moment in our nation's history. And on that somewhat somber note, we'll say goodbye until next time. This is Just Liberty, and I'm here with Alan Reinach. Until next time, remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. So be informed and get involved.